Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. And yes, we have the final installments of those dastardly third-party dark money attack ads against the Bears and Jets, which we'll get to later in the podcast. We do want to tell you today that we're sponsored by Audible. Right now, Three Martini Lunch listeners can start a 30-day trial and get their first audiobook free. All you have to do is go to audible.com/martini or text martini to 500-500. Much more on that in just a moment as well. Jim, let's actually start with the bad martini today, and this is the one that's getting a whole lot of attention, and obviously so here on Wednesday. It's always going to happen that way when you have former presidents of the United States and a major media outlet threatened with deadly violence. This is the NBC News version of the story. Suspicious packages that appear to be working explosives were sent to Hillary Clinton, former President Barack Obama, and CNN's New York newsroom, triggering a nationwide investigation and bipartisan condemnation. The first package intercepted was addressed to the former presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, as well as her husband, the former president, lives there too, and discovered on Tuesday near the Clintons' home in Chappaqua, New York, a suburb of New York City. A second was addressed to Obama and intercepted Wednesday in Washington, D.C., the FBI and Secret Service said in a statement. The third was addressed to former CIA Director John Brennan and discovered Wednesday at CNN's base in Manhattan. Quote, the packages were immediately identified during routine mail screening procedures as potential explosive devices and were appropriately handled as such. Both packages were intercepted prior to being delivered to their intended location. The protectees did not receive the packages, nor were they at risk of receiving them, the statement said. The Secret Service has initiated a full-scope criminal investigation that will leverage all available federal, state, and local resources to determine the source of the packages and identify those responsible. There was also, of course, the explosive device that was found Monday at the home of George Soros in New York. According to NBC News, the devices, which appeared to be working explosives, were in manila packages that included stamps and signatures on them with a return address belonging to Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, according to 3 senior law enforcement officials. So, Jim, I'm pretty sure Debbie Wasserman Schultz is not sending out explosives to prominent political figures in the mail. This is obviously horrific on a grand scale. It doesn't matter which direction this is targeted towards. We just saw ricin attacks towards James Mattis and Susan Collins. And so this is just getting very, very ugly. It's got to stop. And I guess if there's any silver lining here, that there's finally a bipartisan consensus about something. It's sad that it had to be this.
Yeah, Greg, this is really bad on multiple levels. The first level, obviously, it's someone who's doing it. We don't know much about the perpetrator so far, but, it seems pretty clear the intent is to terrorize. And the, devices are being described as rudimentary but potentially effective. Heard some reports about pipes and wires and stuff like that. That you can cause something like this and instantly make the country sit up and take notice is kind of deeply frustrating and horrifying. The second one is my fear and my suspicion is in the next couple of days, you're going to have more of these incidents. Something like this happens and it puts everybody on alert, and all of a sudden, every package that looks like it might be suspicious, people are going to, treat with caution, which is probably the wise thing to do, probably the right thing to do. But you're just going to hear about a lot of evacuations and things like that. And my hope is that no one panics. My hope is that no one freaks out. Most of the time, this is going to turn out to be nothing. We should not be living in fear, and we have really, really good people who handle this kind of stuff. Both the handling of the packages when they arrive and good people at the Secret Service, FBI, and various other law enforcement organizations out trying to catch this guy. So, I'd say to everybody out there, there's always a possibility your workplace will be evacuated. If you do, just, stay calm, get through it. You'll get through the day just fine. Don't let anybody freak you out. Don't let anybody live you in fear. Go out, live your life. We can't hide under our beds, things like that. It does remind me a great deal, Greg, of the anthrax mailings back in fall of 2001 after 9/11 attacks. If you were alive then and you were either in, any place, but particularly in the D.C. area or up in New York, anytime there was somebody who had white powder anywhere, people freaked out. people, evacuations, people checking it. Sometimes it literally was just a matter of somebody knocking over a salt shaker and not sweeping it up, but all of a sudden people freaked out about white powder. I hope we don't go through that again. And the third part of this, how terrible this is this is a good day to stay off Twitter. Almost instantaneously, the instant accusations. Lefties utterly convinced that this is some crazed right-winger who is inspired by Trump's rhetoric. Righties utterly convinced this is a giant false flag operation to make them look bad and a hoax, and lefties are doing this. I had the observation, you look back on a decent amount of the political violence we've seen over the last couple of decades, and people think, this is because of that speech the president gave, or this is because of that speech that Nancy Pelosi gave, or these kinds of stuff. And very often, Greg, it turns out to be some guy who was really upset about the purple trapezoid staring at him. These guys are nuts, and that they don't follow our politics on the level that you or I do, that they've got, they're paranoid schizophrenics. They've got some sort of issue going on in their heads. The Tucson shooter is probably a really good example of this. So we shouldn't be so quick to conclude, this is because of, heated political speech on that side, be wary about this. No, look, folks like this, they got to be caught, got to be prosecuted, got to be locked up and put away for a long time. Hopefully we don't end up in a, very ugly era of finger pointing and things like that. So far, no one's been hurt, and thank God for that. But just this nagging feeling, particularly when we've had several arrive today, the sneaking suspicion that this may be, going on for a couple of days, and that there's somebody out there who's really getting a rise out of all of this. And that just, I don't know about you, Greg, just leaves me seething.
Absolutely. Yeah, it just makes you enraged because, yes, there are important issues going on. Yes, the debate is passionate, but that's what the debate is for. That's what the ballot box is for. That's not how we settle things in this country. It's exactly the reason that our system is set up the way it is because it's supposed to be conducted in a way, our debates, that are resolved in a way that is a grand reflection of our system, not one of ugly retribution that is from centuries past here. And I also tend to agree that we're going to find out this person has some major issues, not just because they're mailing bombs, which is obviously the first clue, but the fact that he thinks John Brennan somehow picks up his mail at CNN's Manhattan headquarters makes you wonder just whether there are any synapses working there at all.
Greg, very often when you deal with guys with people involved in violence and terrorism and things like that, you're not dealing with the sharpest knives in the drawer.
We're going to get to some good news and some crazy news and have some fun later in the podcast. But it's clearly the big news of the morning, and we know a lot of you are thinking about it and talking about it as well. So hopefully the rest of our podcast will be a little bit of an escape from that. And if you need a longer escape, maybe you can find a good book to listen to on your commute or just to listen to as you relax in the evening while you're not watching cable news in the last couple of weeks of a midterm election season and while major public officials are being threatened in such a dastardly way. But when it comes to audiobooks, what would it look like if we all listened more? Listening to audiobooks motivates us, inspires us, and even brings us closer together. And there's simply no better place to listen than Audible, because now Audible members get even more. Exclusive audio fitness programs, audiobooks, Audible originals, and more.
Audible has the largest selection of audiobooks on the planet, and now with Audible Originals, the selection has gotten even more custom with content made for members. Now, I was looking on Audible earlier today, and I found Directorate S by Steve Cole, the CIA and America's Secret Wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. After a morning like this, Greg, there's nothing I like to read about to relax myself and calm myself down than the war on terrorism. Or at the very least, it's kind of reassuring and pleasant to read about terrorists getting killed. Steve Cole won a Pulitzer Prize as the author of Ghost Wars, which basically covered the CIA's involvement in Afghanistan and Pakistan all the way up to 9/11. And it's this great, fascinating book that a lot of people have said is one of the definitive works about this utterly fascinating and consequential period in recent American foreign policy. But it ended right at the point where it got really interesting. 9/11. I'm like, when are you going to do a follow-up? When are you going to keep writing about? Because Afghanistan is one of these places we hear about in the news, but we don't really understand. Very similar story with Pakistan. Directorate S is the book that basically lays this out. I'm finding it absolutely fascinating. Now I'm realizing I could have gotten it on audiobook. It is 28 hours, 30 minutes, narrated by Malcolm Hilgartner. And boy, oh boy, I would definitely be intrigued by getting this one on audiobook. So Audible is the place to look for this sort of thing. Every month, Audible members get 1 credit, good for any audiobook they choose, plus 2 Audible originals from a changing selection that they can't get anywhere else. They also get access to an audio fitness and health workouts created exclusively for Audible. Plus, your books are yours to keep. With Audible, you can go back and re-listen at any time, even if you cancel your membership. Didn't like your audiobook? You can go exchange it, no questions asked.
Start a 30-day trial, and your first audiobook is free. Go to audible.com/martini or text martini to 500-500. You can do it with audiobooks. That's audible.com/martini or text martini to 500-500 to get started. All right, Jim, let's move to our good martini now, and that's looking at a key Senate race, now less than 2 weeks before midterm election day. It's been very tough to get accurate, up-to-date polling on the Indiana Senate race, mainly between Senator Joe Donnelly and businessman Mike Braun, the Republican nominee, because Indiana doesn't allow robocalls of any kind. And so it's very difficult. You have to actually hire people to call residents in Indiana and hope enough of them respond to your survey. So it's a little bit more expensive to do it there. But the last couple polls show something is changing. And kudos here to your colleague and sometime substitute host, Alexander DeSanctis, who went to Indiana to profile Mike Braun and said, even though the polls show Donnelly ahead, that, this is a state with its demographics and Braun's background that could very easily end up with a Republican victory here. And the last couple polls suggest that it is moving in that direction. On Monday, there was a Survey USA poll out showing it a 1-point race with Donnelly still ahead, but 41-40, and then a third-party candidate getting 8%. And then more recently, on Tuesday, in Indy Politics Mason Strategies poll, and that is a Republican-affiliated firm, shows Braun ahead by 47-43, with the third-party candidate only at 3%. So if the momentum's in Braun's favor, Jim, with 13 days to go, that's looking better and better.
You know, Greg, not that long ago, probably about 2 weeks ago, I was talking to Republicans both in Indiana and looking at the Senate races nationally. And there was a little bit of grumbling that Mike Braun was not making the most of a golden opportunity. This is not just a Republican-leaning state. This is not just a state that, Mike Pence is from, a state that Trump won by a wide margin. I believe I want to say about 19 points just 2 years ago. You're taking on a Democrat who was elected in a presidential year and who won with just 50% of the vote. I mean, that's about as golden a setup as you're going to get. And if you want to, probably the closest comparison is Kramer versus Heitkamp up in North Dakota, and Kramer's running away with this thing. So there was a little bit of grumbling about whether Braun was kind of a wet noodle as a candidate, not as good on the stump as they wanted, not as active as they wanted to see him. And now you're finally seeing the polls moving in his direction. So things are looking a little bit better. The funding should be fine. This is not a particularly expensive state to run in. And this is one of those ones where Republicans would say, if Republicans did not knock off Joe Donnelly in this cycle, they'd be kicking themselves, because this is, one, a good opportunity, and two, next time around, he would be running in 2024, which would be a presidential year, and you'd, not only have to deal with him 6 years ago, but that'd probably be higher turnout, and maybe you'd have a tougher time in that cycle. Worth noting, if you look at Joe Donnelly's campaign ads, Greg, you'd think he was a Republican running for re-election. He talks about standing up against the crazy left, yada, yada, yada. And Greg, I don't know about you. If you really wanted to stand up to the crazy left, a good way to do it would have been to vote for Kavanaugh. But he did not do that, which, I think was very revealing. Maybe he felt like he had to do that in order to consolidate his Democratic base, or that if he'd be in tougher shape if he had not voted against the Kavanaugh nomination. But that's where they are. Braun should be capitalizing on it, and it's good to see it's finally happening.
Yeah, let's hope so. Let's hope the momentum continues in that race. And so that's not crazy at all, but we do have some really crazy and ugly, nasty third-party ads about the Bears-Jets game coming up in just a few minutes right after our crazy martini. All right, let's get to our crazy martini now. And the Caravan, which some people on the right are now calling a mob or an invading army. Caravan sounds a little too friendly on the other side. So, Jim, I'm not sure what terminology you prefer, but let's just say there's a large group of people traipsing through Mexico right now, trying to get into the United States and doing so illegally. So President Trump mentioned this, among a lot of other things, at the Texas rally for Ted Cruz and other Republicans in the Lone Star State on Monday. And Chuck Todd played a bit of that yesterday and then reacted to it in a way that ought to leave our heads scratching a little bit.
What's happening right now, as a large group of people, they call it a caravan. I think the Democrats had something to do with it, and now they're saying, I think we made a big mistake, because people are seeing how bad it is, how pathetic it is. And in that caravan, you have some very bad people. You have some very bad people.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that. Keep in mind there is no evidence of any criminals in the Central American caravan. No evidence that somehow Democrats are funding the caravan. We've even heard this bizarre George Soros rumor sitting out there.
Okay, well, the last part, I don't know that there's a ton of verification for, or at least with any specificity about Democrats being responsible for this. I'm sure folks are digging into that to see if there's anything to it. But, Jim, the first part about there being no evidence, that's one of the reasons why you need to screen all these people, because we just don't know. But some people say that they do know, one of whom is this guy who's in the caravan.
Criminals is everywhere, okay? It's criminals in here. I mean, it is, but it's not that many. I mean, it's good people in here trying to get through Mexico and then get to the United States, but that doesn't mean that everybody's a criminal.
So not everybody's a criminal, but over at the Department of Homeland Security, which you would think is kind of on top of something like this, the spokesperson with 3 tweets there, his name is Tyler Holton. First of all, he says DHS can confirm that there are individuals within the caravan who are gang members or have significant criminal histories. Second tweet, citizens of countries outside Central America, including countries in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, and elsewhere, are currently traveling through Mexico toward the U.S. Final tweet, stopping the caravan is not just about national security or preventing crime. It is also about national sovereignty and the rule of law. Those who seek to come to America must do so the right and legal way. So, Jim, obviously there's a lot of political ramifications in this issue, so the rhetoric is intensifying here. But for Chuck Todd to just assume that there's not a single criminal in a group of, 10,000 or more people now, that's narrative building if I've ever heard it.
Yeah, Greg. I mean, I know Chuck Todd at some point has to have traveled abroad. And when you come back, if you fly back into, God help you, Dulles International Airport, you have a really long line on having passport checked. And why are they checking your passport? Because they want to know if you're a criminal. They want to know if there's warrants out for you. They want to know if you're there's some sort of Interpol warning about you or a BOLO notice or anything like that. Because we want to know who's coming into this country. Now, Greg, if you and I assume maybe if you're hosting Meet the Press, you get a special lane. Maybe they just kind of wave them through. Come here, Mr. No line for you, Mr. Todd. Come on through. But if all of us have to stand on line, an extraordinarily slow-moving line, I would add, at Dulles International Airport, I would assume that everybody else who wants to get into the country would have to do the same thing. And you don't just get to wave through because there's 10,000 of you, and that would take a really long time. Because you know why? There are times there have been lots and lots of people on those lines at International Airport. Or when you come back from, say, the National Review cruise, and they have 3 people working at the booths and like 3,000 or 4,000 people getting off the boat at the same time. Not that I'm bitter, Greg. Anyway, besides my travel woes, the point here is that you're right. We don't know who's in these people. And yeah, they're probably not the most, it's probably not Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi sneaking through with that couple thousand people. But there could be criminals in there. There could not. We don't know. If they just swarm over the border, then we can't check. And that's the whole point. Is maybe there are people with criminal records in there. Maybe there are people who we don't want to get in there. I am really struck by this because Democrats really, really want to talk about the, let's say, highly speculative statements the President of the United States is saying. And you want to give them grief about that, fine, but that still doesn't change the fact that, okay, Democrats, what do you want to do when they get here? What is your policy? And I wrote about this in the Morning Jolt today because, and it's not just, crazy right-wingers like you and me, Greg. I mean, the Washington Post, David Leonhardt writing in the New York Times. People notice that the Democratic Congress, members of Democratic Congress, Democratic candidates don't want to talk about the caravan. And in fact, I believe it was a statement explicitly from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer saying, we're not going to be distracted. We're focusing on health care. Okay, but no matter how much you want to talk about health care, you still got to deal with the caravan. And we'd like to know, hey, Democrats, what do you want to do regarding this caravan? Because we know what Donald Trump wants to do. We know what most congressional Republicans want to do. Don't let them in. Sorry, guys, you turned away at the border. If you manage to sneak over, we're going to arrest you. We're going to deport you. We believe in ICE. There's a whole bunch of guys on the other side who are chanting abolish ICE. What do Democrats want to do? Now, I'm sure there are some Democrats who agree. Yeah, we should not allow them to come in. I think there's a decent number of Democrats who would indeed allow them in because they feel like having a border is somehow inherently xenophobic, that it is somehow inherently unjust. Some would prevent them from coming in, but they'd probably feel very guilty about it. And I think through their actions, Greg, we're seeing from a bunch of Democrats, they just would rather not talk about it. They'd rather talk about healthcare, and that's great. We can talk about healthcare. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. I was looking, Greg, at this obviously this infamous guy. He's a crazed, arch-conservative, right-wing xenophobe named, let me just check out. Oh, David Frum. Yes. David Frum, who writes, quote, "The theory behind the caravans, this latest and the smaller predecessors over the last 15 years, is that Central Americans have valid asylum claims in the United States because of the pervasive underemployment and gang violence problems in their countries. If that claim is true, that is a claim shared not only by the thousands in the current caravan, by the millions back home. If these people have a legal right to asylum in the United States, then pretty much the entire countries of Nicaragua and Guatemala and El Salvador have the exact same claims. And Democrats, if you want to import the populations of Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala into the United States, you sure as hell had better say so explicitly and let the voters judge you on that." That's my closing point, Greg.
Yeah, very, very well said.
The only thing that could ruin my day at this point now would be a really nasty attack ad going after the Jets.
Well, we told you yesterday that this was going to be the final day of the attack ads that these shadowy third-party groups have been able to procure time for here on the Three Martini Lunch. And, well, let's just say our fears have been more than fully realized. Here they are in back-to-back once again.
Greg Corombos thinks you should root for the Chicago Bears this Sunday instead of the New York Jets. But what do we really know about Chicago? We know it's a city where the economy runs on corruption and deep dish. We know this is the city of Al Capone, Rod Blagojevich, and Michael Wilbon. This is the city that wrongfully prosecuted Dr. Richard Kimball. Even the songs about Chicago don't make sense. In 1974, Paper Lace recorded the song The Night Chicago Died, and a lyric claimed Daddy was a cop on the east side of Chicago. But the east side of Chicago is Lake Michigan. Was he an underwater cop? Did he wear flippers and a scuba mask? Greg Corombos has no answers, but he still roots for Chicago. And that's fine if you like Moscow on Lake Michigan. Paid for by Americans United Against Chicago.
As you decide who to cheer for this Sunday, think about how you'll explain your decision to your children, because the choice is clear. Chicago is the hardworking city of broad shoulders. The great Frank Sinatra loved the city so much, he called Chicago, quote, my kind of town. Jim Geraghty and the Jets say Sinatra's song about their city is even better. That's a lie. No such song even exists. Sinatra never once sang about East Rutherford, New Jersey. That's right. The Jets don't even play in New York. They play in a New Jersey town whose claim to fame is that notorious union boss Jimmy Hoffa may have been buried under the stadium the Jets called home for decades. The Jets can't tell the truth about who they are and might be complicit in murder. What will you tell your children? You just can't trust Jim Geraghty and the Jets. The Ground the Jets Political Action Committee is responsible for the content of this advertisement. Whew, Jim, it's a good thing we called it off there. We just couldn't handle any more ads. I do have to say the Chicago PD's treatment of Richard Kimball was horrific. I cannot defend that in any way, shape, or form. But, boy, the Sinatra argument there, pretty powerful in the other direction.
You know, Greg, I'm just going to observe that I believe it was back in 1986, the Jets against the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC wildcard game. I want to say it was Al Toon who scored a touchdown in the south end zone where my dad and my brother and I we had season tickets back then. Toon scored. He spiked the football right in the end zone, and the whole stadium heard, ouch. So maybe Hoffa was there. But I think that just makes the old Meadowlands, because I don't call it Giant Stadium, because it's really embarrassing to play in a stadium named after your opponent. That just made that stadium even cooler. Kind of made this infamous, scary history to it. Now we play in MetLife Stadium, and we're kind of left with this bizarre. How did the Jets end up playing in MetLife Stadium and not the New York Mets? Obviously, the most natural corporate sponsor for the stadium that we share with the Giants would be JetBlue.
That's right. Oh, they need to hire you. They need to hire you to be sure. But
if they hired me, there'd be a lot of changes, Greg. A lot of changes.
Well,
starting with beating the Bears.
Good news all around here. The shadowy third money ads have come to an end, and I'm glad to say that our professional and personal relationship is still strong. And the good news is I'll actually be here the next 2 days, even though I didn't think I would be. So, Jim, it's been an interesting week leading up to the game. Back at it with 3 more martinis tomorrow. Talk to you then.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And don't forget to visit our good friends over at Audible. Start a 30-day trial and get your first audiobook free. Audible.com/martini or text the word martini to 500-500. And tune in again Thursday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.